Welcome, deep divers. Today, we're casting our nets wide into a topic that really touches nearly every plate. The future of the food we pull from our oceans.
It's a huge one.
It really is. For me, the sea was, well, an early obsession. I grew up with this real fishing Jones. Started with largemouth bass, then got brave enough for Long Island Sound, learned to navigate alone by 13. I'd even sell my extra catch sometimes to my teachers, believe it or not, just for gas money. The sea back then just felt boundless, like this wild frontier, a great equalizer.
That feeling, that sense of a wild, inexhaustible ocean. It's so common, isn't it? Especially if you grew up near it, like an endless pantry.
Exactly.
But as you found out later, especially coming back from places like frustratingly landlocked and ruined Bosnia, where the rivers were basically ultimately fishless, well, that idea of infinite supply started to crack, didn't it?
It really did. That adult urge to fish came back strong, but it felt different. There was this suspicion. I kept seeing fewer fish, smaller fish, way too many empty buckets along the shore.
That nagging feeling.
And that feeling, it really solidified in the early 2000s. I was traveling a lot up and down the eastern seaboard, popping into fish markets, Palm Beach, Charleston, all the way up to Portland, Maine.
Right.
And what I saw was, well, it was uncanny. It was always the same four fish dominating the displays. Salmon, sea bass, cod, and tuna.
Everywhere.
Everywhere, regardless of the local waters. It was this weird consistency that hit me. Just like when I was a kid and saw my little stream flow into the Byram River and suddenly grasped the scale of the ocean.
Yeah, I get that.
This was like that. Seeing those four fish everywhere just sparked this mission, this need to understand what on earth happened to these specific species.
And that right there, that's our mission for you today, our curious listener. We're taking a deep dive into these four fish. They're almost archetypes, really.
Good word for it.
And through their stories, we're going to trace how humanity has fundamentally reshaped its relationship with marine life. Through exploitation, domestication, management.
Big shifts.
Huge shifts. And you're going to uncover some surprising facts, maybe confront that psychological denial about overfishing that's clouded things for so long. And ultimately, we'll look at what the future might hold for, well, what many people still think of as the last wild food.
Okay, let's jump in. First archetype, salmon, the selection of a king. Now, once upon a time, Atlantic salmon, this was a foundational staple, right?
Absolutely. Wild abundance.
Rivers like the Connecticut or up in Nova Scotia, they were just teeming with them. But today, if you buy Atlantic salmon in the store, doesn't matter if the label says Canadian, Irish, Scotch, Norwegian, it's almost certainly farmed. So what happened? How did this wild king just disappear?
Well, the decline of the wild Atlantic salmon was disturbingly swift. You had factors like dams, of course. Think of Turner's Falls on the Connecticut River. There aren't even any natural falls left there now. They completely blocked migration.
Right, critical routes cut off.
Exactly. And then crucially, in the 50s and 60s, a small group of Danish and Faroes fishermen figured out the main spot off Greenland where basically all the world's wild Atlantic salmon gathered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That led to this massive, unprecedented commercial harvest, a huge concentration of fishing effort, and the populations just plummeted. They've never really recovered from that.
Such a devastating blow. But that decline, it did spur a whole new approach, domestication.
It did, yeah. Back in the early 60s, you had these Norwegian brothers, Sivert and Ovi Grintvedt. They started experimenting, raising salmon juveniles in net cages in the fjords.
So what made salmon so, adaptable to this kind of farming? Why them?
Well, salmon had a few biological advantages, you could say. Unlike a lot of fish that hatch from tiny eggs and need microscopic food, salmon come from these big nutrient-packed eggs.
Okay.
They live off that oily yolk sac for weeks, so they could transition pretty quickly to eating chopped fish, which conveniently was abundant from the herring catches in Norway back then.
Oh, makes sense.
So by protecting them from predators, giving them steady food, these early farmers basically flipped nature's high mortality rates for young salmon right on their head.
Interesting. And then these early efforts, they kind of connected with bigger ideas, didn't they?
Yeah.
This wasn't just about keeping baby fish alive. It got supercharged by ideas from the Green Revolution.
Absolutely. You had J. Lawrence Lush, an American professor back in the Depression era. He developed these theories about animal breeding, focusing on improving whole populations for efficiency, especially that key metric, feed conversion ratio.
Right, how much feed it takes to get a pound of product.
Exactly. And a Norwegian sheep breeder, Trygve Vedrum, he met Lush and was just captivated. He realized luscious principles could be applied directly to salmon.
And salmon had a secret weapon for that, right?
They did. Their sheer reproductive capacity. I mean, cattle or sheep, a few offspring, salmon, thousands of eggs.
Huge difference.
Massive.
Yeah.
This allowed for incredibly rapid genetic progress. Jedgeran's team saw, get this, a 13 to 14% improvement in growth rate per generation. They essentially created a domestic salmon population, very different from its wild ancestors, astonishingly quickly.
Incredible efficiency, agriculturally speaking. But, that kind of rapid progress often has downsides.
Yeah.
What were some of the environmental trade-offs with this intensive salmon farming?
Yeah, there were definitely significant ones. First, the feed issue. It's gotten better, but farm salmon still need quite a bit of wild fish in their diet. It's less than 3 pounds now for 1 pound of salmon, down from maybe 6 pounds before, but it's still a factor.
Still taking wild fish to make farmed fish.
Right. Then you've got the disease problem, things like infectious salmon anemia or ISA and parasites like sea lice. These can spread like wildfire in dense farm populations and, worryingly, can spill over and infect wild fish too.
That's a big concern.
And finally, there's the constant risk of escapes. Farmed fish get out, mix with wild stocks, and potentially weaken the genetic diversity and resilience of those already fragile wild populations.
These are serious issues, but maybe complex, hard to quantify. They didn't seem to grab huge public attention right away. Then, in the early 2000s, a different alarm bell went off, this one aimed right at the consumer's plate.
That's right. The 2004 Heights and Carpenter study. Funded by Pew Charitable Trusts, it found higher levels of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, in farmed salmon.
Okay, PCBs. Why were they higher in farmed fish, and how did the industry push back?
Well, the study traced it to the feed. PCBs bioconcentrate up the food chain. Plankton absorb them, little fish eat the plankton, then those little fish get ground up into pellets for the salmon.
So it gets concentrated.
Exactly. The toxins accumulate to much higher levels the further up you go. The industry's response was to highlight the significant omega-3 fatty acid benefits DHA, EPA, in oily fish like salmon. They argued these health benefits outweighed the PCD risks.
A risk-benefit argument.
Pretty much. Dr. Dariush Mozafarian, who did a study on this, even admitted it was kind of like comparing sesame seeds with watermelons, Hard to make a simple comparison. But this whole debate, it really created this strong, wild good, farmed bad idea in the public mind.
But did it actually change buying habits long-term?
Not really overall. Farmed salmon consumption just kept on growing.
Now, amidst all this farming talk, there is still a place where wildness reigns, right?
Alaska.
Alaska, yes.
Yeah.
One of the last great salmon strongholds.
You take the Yukon king salmon, for example. It comes from one of those last primeval salmon territories. And you have operations like Quick Pack Fisheries, native-owned, fair trade certified, trying to do sustainable wild harvest. But they're always juggling things, right? Like escapement goals.
Constantly. Escapement goals are set by the Department of Fish and Game. It's the minimum number of salmon that must escape the nets and make it upstream to spawn to keep the cycle going. It's this delicate, ongoing balancing act.
A balance between human needs and nature's needs. Exactly. And there's this really poignant story about a Yupik fisherman, Ray Waska. He bartered a beautiful, fresh, 30-pound Yukon king salmon for frozen chicken and ground beef from an oil tanker crew.
Wow, this is a lot.
It really does. It just throws this massive global imbalance into sharp relief. In Alaska, wild salmon outnumber humans maybe 1,500 to 1, but globally, humans outnumber wild salmon about 7 to 1. That trade wasn't just about fish. It was about, totally different worldviews colliding.
The sort of Judeo-Christian drive for improvement and transformation versus the Yupik way of waiting for nature's bounty to return.
Precisely. A deep philosophical difference right there on the riverbank.
But even in Alaska, that idea of wild is getting fuzzy, isn't it? I read that almost 1 in 3 wild Alaskan salmon actually started life in a hatchery.
That's right. It's done to supplement wild production, to boost numbers. But it means they bypass natural selection. The fish that might not have survived in the wild get a head start.
Which could potentially weaken the overall genetic strength of the truly wild fish over time.
That's the concern. Are we inadvertently creating fish that lack the genetic toolkit to handle the full range of challenges out there? It's a subtle but potentially huge long-term trade-off.
A gamble.
It is. But shifting back to aquaculture for a second, there is a glimmer of a possibly more sustainable approach emerging. Thierry Chopin and Cook Aquaculture are working on something called integrated multitrophic aquaculture, or IMTA, up in the Bay of Fundy.
Okay, IMTA, integrated multi-trophic. Sounds complex. What does that actually look like? A polyculture system?
Yeah, think of it like creating a more complete ecosystem around the salmon pens. It's inspired partly by ancient Chinese carp farms. You combine the fed species, the salmon, with things that extract nutrients from the water, like seaweeds, and things that eat organic particles, like mussels or sea urchins.
So they clean up after the salmon, essentially.
In a way, yes. They create a more balanced system. For instance, they found mussels can actually absorb the ISA virus right out of the water column, potentially breaking disease cycles.
That's fascinating.
And those mussels, they develop enhanced nutritional profiles, 30% more meat, high in omega-3s. It's still mostly pilot projects, but IMTA shows real potential for a more maybe regenerative kind of aquaculture.
Definitely something to watch. Okay, so moving from the king salmon story, our deep dive now takes us to a fish that kind of shows a different side of this wildness illusion. Sea bass, the holiday fish, goes to work.
Right. You ask most people what fish is farmed, and they'd probably say salmon, maybe trout.
Yeah.
But the reality is aquaculture is the fastest growing food production system on the planet. It's very likely already churning out more seafood than wild capture fisheries.
And a prime example of how we miss this is branzino, right? That European sea bass that got super trendy in upscale U.S. restaurant.
Exactly. It always had this vague, romantic European origin story attached to it.
Yeah, flown in fresh from Europe.
Right, which conveniently obscured the fact that the vast majority was and is farmed.
So the name bass itself, it's kind of a catch-all term, isn't it?
It really is. Most of the fish we call bass, including European sea bass, belong to this huge order, the perciforms. Literally means perch-shaped.
Perch-shaped.
It's the biggest vertebrate order on Earth, over 7,000 species. And what's interesting is their evolutionary tricks, like having a swim bladder for neutral buoyancy and that white, mostly boneless flesh, made them relatively easy targets for early European fishermen and consistently desirable as food.
Even the Romans had opinions on them, called them intelligent or sea wolves.
They did. Apparently they admired their cunning, but these desirable fish lived in the Mediterranean, which is mostly oligotrophic.
Eating.
Low in nutrients, not very productive, naturally. So the wild sea bass populations there were smaller, more sensitive, easily overfished. By the 1960s, wild stocks were in trouble.
Which created this drive for alternatives, especially in places like Israel, pushing for food security.
Exactly. Post-1950s, Israel had this strong national push to produce its own food. They didn't have much fresh water, but they had coastline. And then, after the Six-Day War in '67, they gained control of Lake Bardawal on the Sinai coast.
And that lake was key.
Crucial. It's hypersaline, super salty, which turns out to be perfect for sea bass spawning. And that's where a young endocrinologist named Jonathan Zohar started his critical work.
This is the breakthrough story, right? The Rosetta Stone.
This is it. Zohar spent a decade trying to figure out how to get sea bass to spawn reliably in tanks. It was painstaking work. He literally tweezed the pituitary glands out of tens of thousands of fish to isolate hormones.
Wow.
He eventually discovered a new hormone involved in spawning. And then, the final piece, he engineered this tiny polymer sphere that could release the hormone predictably, triggering mass spawning on demand.
Incredible. A true game changer.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about sea bass. It unlocked the potential for mass spawning many other important fish species in captivity. And that technology spread fast. You had guys like Thanasis Frentsos, a Greek marine biologist.
Right, the guy trying to bring sea bass back to Greece.
Yeah, a real patriotic mission for him. Local stocks had been decimated by Italian poachers using dynamite, so he went to Sicily to get fingerlings to restart things. But then, disaster struck during transport.
What happened?
A simple kinked oxygen hose in the transport tank. Thousands of those precious fingerlings died. It just shows how fragile those early efforts were.
Definitely highlights the challenges. And there were other problems too, right? Like the fish themselves had issues early on.
Yeah, early farmed sea bass often had crooked backbones. Turned out it was linked to swim bladder development problems, possibly caused by the rich oils in their feed. And feeding the tiniest baby fish, the larvae, was a huge hurdle. They needed microscopic live food. The solution: tiny crustaceans called rotifers and artemia.
Artemia. Wait, aren't those?
Yep. Better known as sea monkeys, thanks to the eccentric inventor Harold von Braunhut. They became absolutely essential for raising marine fish larvae.
Sea monkeys saved the sea bass industry.
In a way, yeah. And then another big challenge, especially for freshwater fish like tilapia and tra that were also being farmed, was off flavor. That muddy pond scum taste.
Right, nobody wants that.
Exactly. The key was figuring out how to raise them in clean, flowing water systems and feeding them grain or soy-based pellets. That got rid of the off flavor and made them palatable, even desirable to Western consumers.
So overcoming those hurdles led to big success.
Huge success. Greece, for example, now exports something like 100 million pleat-sized farmed sea bass every year. But here's the kicker, the real twist in the tale.
Okay.
Jonathan Zohar, the guy who cracked the spawning code. His later DNA work revealed something fascinating. A lot of the supposedly wild sea bass caught in the Mediterranean today are genetically traced back to farmed stocks, specifically the Western stock developed largely by the French.
No way. So even the wild ones aren't purely wild anymore.
Many aren't, genetically speaking. So Greek sea bass, even the wild ones, are often, you could say, genetically fish of France.
That really does blur the lines, doesn't it? It makes you question what wild even means anymore.
It absolutely does. Can we even reliably distinguish wild from farmed in some cases? It's a profound consequence of our interventions.
Wow. Okay, let's shift gears again. From the subtle illusion of sea bass to a fish with a much more dramatic story of boom and bust. Cod, the return of the commoner.
Ah, cod. The fish that practically built nations.
Right. It nourished humanity for centuries, from medieval times onwards. Mark Kurlansky's book, Cod, really captured that epic history. But this incredibly abundant fish, it just collapsed. Places like the Grand Banks, Georges Bank, virtually wiped out. What went so wrong?
It was a perfect storm, really. Industrial fishing technology got incredibly efficient, maybe too efficient. Huge nets, bottom trawls, and crucially rock hoppers devices that let nets bounce over rocky bottoms where cod used to hide.
So there was nowhere left to hide.
Pretty much. But compounding that was this surprisingly persistent scientific belief that cod were just too numerous, too fecund, to ever be truly overfished.
They thought they were inexhaustible.
Many did, yes. The scale of the loss when it finally happened was staggering, equivalent to the weight of maybe 27 million people vanishing from the banks. It was a failure of technology, management, and, frankly, imagination.
And that failure, that inability to see it coming, connects directly to Daniel Pauly's concept of shifting baselines, doesn't it?
Perfectly. Explain that a bit.
Well, Pauly's idea is that each generation accepts the level of abundance they first encounter as the normal baseline. So as stocks decline gradually over decades, each new generation sets their expectations lower without realizing what's been lost.
Right. And you experienced this yourself, didn't you, on that Georges Bank trip?
I did. I caught quite a few cod, actually. And my first thought was, what shortage? This seems fine. Even though the captain told me it was just a so-so day.
Exactly. Your baseline was already shifted way down from what his grandfather or even his father would have considered a good day. It makes it incredibly hard to convince people there's a problem when their current reality seems okay to them.
It's like collective amnesia. Makes conservation so much harder.
It really does. This psychological denial, as the author calls it, is a huge barrier. But despite that, there has been a real fight to bring cod back.
Yeah, things started to change, right? There was a legal action.
There was. The Conservation Law Foundation actually sued the U.S. government. That forced the National Marine Fisheries Service, under Bill Fox at the time, to finally establish a legal definition of overfishing in 1993.
A crucial step.
Absolutely. And then in 1994, they took a really bold step. They closed 2 huge areas of Georges Bank to bottom fishing, created massive de facto marine reserves.
Wow, closing off huge areas like that.
It was controversial but necessary, and it set the stage for the Sustainable Fisheries Act a couple of years later, which mandated ending overfishing and rebuilding all American commercial fish stocks.
Did it work? Have stocks rebuilt?
It's a mixed bag, and it takes time. The target dates keep getting pushed back for some stocks, like Georges Bank cod is now 2026, I think. But there have been definite successes. Gulf of Maine cod and haddock, for example, showed significant recovery thanks to these measures. It proves that closing areas and managing scientifically can work if you give it enough time and stick with it.
That brings us to someone like Ted Ames, former Maine cod fisherman, MacArthur Genius Grant winner. His approach seems different.
Very different. He realized the official science was missing a lot, so he started interviewing old-timers, fishermen who knew the grounds intimately before the collapse.
What did he find?
He mapped over 1,000 square miles of historical cod spawning grounds that the federal surveys had completely missed. Their data only showed about 200.
That's a massive difference.
Huge. And his research also showed it wasn't just overfishing. Habitat destruction played a big role too, like dams blocking rivers, which meant fewer herring runs, and herring are a key food source for cod.
So it's a whole ecosystem.
Exactly, and his proposed solution reflects that. He talks about a fisherman as herder model.
Fisherman as herder, what does that mean?
It means small-scale fishers using their deep local knowledge, adapting their gear, catching only what the specific area can support, maybe even letting certain spots lie fallow for a while to recover, like a farmer rotates fields.
More like stewardship than industrial extraction.
Precisely, a localized, adaptive approach, a stark contrast to the big industrial boats.
It sounds like a much better way for wild stocks.
Yeah.
But what about farming cod? I mean, salmon worked, sea bass worked. Someone must have tried cod, right?
Oh, they did. Karol Radzikowski up in the Shetlands, he was inspired by Kurlansky's book, saw the public awareness, the marketing potential for safe cod. He even called his company No Catch.
Catchy name. But it failed.
It did, yeah. Economically, it just didn't pencil out.
Why not? What was wrong with cod?
A couple things. Cod have these big, bony heads, not much meat yield there, and not something Western consumers generally want on their plate, so lots of waste. And crucially, they just take too long to grow, 3 years to get to market size. Compare that to salmon or sea bass. It just wasn't economically viable for mass production.
Too slow, too much waste.
Basically, yeah. There are still efforts, especially in Norway, trying to make farmed cod work. But the world needs a cheap, reliable whitefish, a kind of ground chuck of the sea, and farmed cod hasn't filled that niche.
So if farmed cod isn't the answer, what is filling that huge demand for whitefish fillets? We see things like MSC certification.
Right, the Marine Stewardship Council. Interestingly, that was initially set up by Unilever, the food giant, partly in response to a Greenpeace boycott over cod sourcing.
Ah, industry trying to get ahead of the curve.
You could say that, but the MSC certification itself has been pretty controversial over the years.
How so?
Well, take the New Zealand hoki fishery. It got certified, then decertified, then recertified. Critics argued the standards were too lax, that fisheries were being certified despite ongoing environmental concerns.
Right.
And the Alaska pollock fishery, that's the biggest source of wild whitefish globally, now it faces constant criticism too. Environmental groups like Greenpeace, scientists like Jeff Shester at Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch, they point to the impacts of massive midwater trawls, the effects on the seafloor, potential impacts on seals and sea lions, and argue that industry influence on management is too strong.
Despite the industry saying it's well managed.
Exactly. It's that classic conflict. As one observer bluntly put it, you should never get between a fat hog and a trough. The economic stakes are just enormous.
That quote does capture the dynamic, doesn't it? Okay, so if these big oceanic whitefish are still under pressure and farmed cod isn't really scaling up, where is the bulk of that cheap, unfishy whitefish coming from now?
Increasingly, it's coming from freshwater aquaculture, particularly two species, Vietnamese tra, which you might see labeled as besa or pangasius,
Right, I've seen those names.
and tilapia. Tra is amazing. It thrives in stagnant ponds. It can even gulp air if the water quality is poor. Tilapia, historically, could practically live off algae and waste.
Very resilient fish.
Extremely. But the key to cracking the big first world markets was getting rid of that off flavor.
The muddy taste again.
Yeah. Raising them in cleaner flowing water systems and feeding them corn and soy pellets did the trick. It made them taste, well, like almost nothing.
The unfishy fish.
Exactly. Which sounds bad, but it's actually perfect for processing. You can flavor it however you want. That's why they've exploded in production and end up in things like generic fish sandwiches at fast food places, often marketed as tasting like pollock.
Fascinating how taste, or lack thereof, drives the market.
Yeah.
Okay, that brings us to our final archetype, tuna one last bite.
The ultimate ocean predator.
Oh, absolutely. I've been out tuna fishing, way out on the Hudson Canyon, battling rough seas, hooking into a bluefin. The power is just unbelievable.
They're incredible machines.
Fastest fish in the sea, warm-blooded, roam the entire ocean. And the difference between seeing one alive, all iridescent blues and pinks and silvers, and seeing one dead on ice, it's night and day. Truly profound.
That power, that beauty, it's captivating. And after World War II, Japan's need for food, and especially for export income, really drove the expansion of tuna fishing globally.
And then technology played a role again, right?
Big time. The invention of reliable deep freezing technology in the 1970s, that meant high-quality tuna for sushi could be shipped anywhere in the world. Suddenly, bluefin wasn't just a local delicacy, it was a global luxury commodity.
which led to the bluefin dilemma we face now.
Precisely. The stocks, particularly Atlantic bluefin, both the western stock that spawns in the Gulf of Mexico and the eastern one in the Mediterranean, have just declined relentlessly.
Why has it been so hard to manage them?
Global overfishing, plain and simple, and a total failure, really, to establish effective international agreements that nations actually stick to. These fish cross too many borders.
And we target the big ones, don't we? The giant spawners.
We do. Those huge fish, 500 pounds or more, they're the most valuable, but they're also the most important breeders. Taking them out has a disproportionately huge impact on the population's ability to reproduce. It's like logging only the oldest, biggest trees in a forest.
Right. I remember reading a quote from a commercial bluefin harpooner who said something like, "I love these fish, but I love to catch them."
That captures the conflict perfectly, doesn't it? The respect and awe, but also the economic drive. And when a single fish can fetch, $150,000 or even more at auction in Tokyo, the incentive to catch them is just immense.
That kind of money.
Ah.
Wow. And then there's this weird kind of farming that actually makes things worse.
Yeah, it's perverse, really. They catch wild juvenile bluefin, often in the Mediterranean, tow them slowly into pens near shore, and then fatten them up for the market.
So they're not breeding them, just catching young ones.
Exactly. It represents a net loss from the wild population. These fish are removed before they ever get a chance to breed. It's hitting the population at both ends, taking the big breeders and scooping up the young ones. It's driven entirely by market demand, but it actively undermines the resource itself.
It seems so unsustainable. But you've mentioned before there's an interesting parallel with whales here, isn't there? How our perception changed.
It's a really compelling parallel. For centuries, whales were just seen as big fish, useful sources of oil and meat. Even scientifically, that view persisted for a long time.
Linnaeus classified them as mammals in the late 18th century, but it took a while for that to sink in.
A long while. There was actually a court case in New York in 1818, Maurice versus Judd, where a jury still ruled that a whale was legally a fish, despite all the scientific evidence presented. Shows how sticky old ideas can be.
So what changed the public mind about whales?
It was gradual, a cultural shift. Things like the story of the whaling ship Essex being sunk by a whale, Moby Dick, basically. Then, much later, Roger Payne's album, Songs of the Humpback Whale in the 70s. It sold millions. It popularized the idea that whales were intelligent, complex creatures, not just swimming resources.
Right, giving them a voice.
Exactly. And then that iconic Greenpeace image from 1975, the little inflatable boat between the harpoon ship and the whale. That just cemented whales as wildlife in the public consciousness. Symbols of wilderness needing protection.
And the result? Whales became largely protected, mostly taken off the menu.
Right. But tuna, they remain firmly in the food category. Even highly endangered bluefin are still a prized delicacy.
And consumer campaigns like Seafood Watch telling people not to eat bluefin haven't really worked for tuna, have they?
Sadly, not much impact on the overall fishing pressure. It seems to confirm that idea. To most people, an animal is either food or wildlife. There's not much middle ground in our collective psychology.
And attempts to get international protection, like listing bluefin on sites.
Failed? Repeatedly. Usually gets bogged down in national economic interests and arguments over fishing quotas. It highlights the limits of international cooperation when big money is involved.
So if managing wild tuna is so difficult, and fattening juveniles is harmful, what's the future for getting that steaky fish experience sustainably?
Well, there are people rationally pursuing aquaculture for other fish that fill a similar niche. Look at Neil Sims and Kona Blue in Hawaii. They chose a fish called the almaco jack, locally known as kahala.
Kahala, why that fish?
It's got firm, steak-like flesh, but it's not really fished commercially in the wild because it can sometimes carry ciguatera toxin in certain reef environments.
Ah, a natural deterrent to fishing it.
Right. But when it's farmed offshore in controlled conditions, it's perfectly safe. And crucially, it has an excellent feed conversion ratio around 1.6 or 2 to 1, much better than fattening wild tuna. And they raise them in these big, open ocean submersible cages with minimal environmental impact.
But it's not tuna. There's a marketing challenge, right? Selling an unfamiliar fish.
Definitely. Sims calls it Kona Kampachi to give it a more appealing, sort of premium-sounding name. But biologically and taste-wise, it's a great alternative. It has about 30% fat content, similar to tuna, great for sushi. It could absolutely satisfy that sashimi yen, as the author puts it.
A potential substitute. And meanwhile, the science for actually breeding bluefin in captivity, that's moving forward too.
It is, remarkably. Remember Jonathan Zohar's hormone tech for sea bass?
The Rosetta Stone guy?
That's him. Well, in 2009, a company called Clean Seas in Australia used his basic technology to achieve the first large-scale captive spawning of southern bluefin tuna.
Wow. So it is possible to close the life cycle.
It seems so. The fundamental biological hurdles are being overcome thanks to that earlier work on other species. Now, whether it can be done economically at scale and what the environmental footprint would be, those are still big questions, but the biology is getting there.
Okay, so we've journeyed through salmon, sea bass, cod, and tuna. This deep dive really underscores, just how critical the state of our oceans is.
It's undeniable.
And it feels like simply relying on individual consumers to make the right choice at the fish counter, while maybe good-intentioned, just isn't enough to tackle the scale of the problem.
It hasn't been, no. It helps raise awareness, but it doesn't fundamentally change the industrial pressures or the management failures. Which brings us back to those core questions. How many fish do we actually need? And crucially, how many are really left out there?
So if individual choice isn't the whole answer, what is? We need bigger, bolder actions, right?
Absolutely. We need societal action, strategies that go beyond just market forces. The author proposes three noble and ultimately effective principles, as he puts it, for genuinely rebuilding the seas.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, ocean zoning. We need to convert significant portions of ocean ecosystems into permanent no-catch marine reserves, real sanctuaries. Right now, it's maybe only 1%, maybe slightly more, of the oceans that are strongly protected.
Just 1%. That seems tiny.
It is shockingly small. Think of it like taking some of our ocean wealth and putting it into safe, low-interest municipal bonds. Not for maximum immediate profit, but for guaranteed, steady returns over the long term. Secure breeding grounds, nursery habitats, letting nature rebuild capital.
A biological safety net. Makes sense. What's principle number 2?
Second, global protection of unmanageable species. This is for fish, like bluefin tuna, the ones that roam across too many borders, exist in the high seas where governance is weak. If these species continue to decline despite management attempts, we need to be willing to advocate for complete fishery closures.
Treat them like endangered land animals.
Essentially, yes. Elevate them to the same protective status we give tigers or rhinos or whales. Acknowledge that some species are simply incompatible with large-scale industrial harvesting and should be treated primarily as wildlife, not food. That requires a global ethical shift.
A big shift indeed. And the third principle?
Third, strategic domestication. This is about consciously guiding our appetite, moving away from harvesting sensitive, hard-to-manage wild species and towards sustainable, productive, domesticated fish.
But choosing the right ones.
Crucially, yes, selecting species that work well in farming systems efficiently with minimal environmental impact and that can coexist alongside healthy wild ocean food systems. We probably need both wild and farmed fish for our, nutritional and even our emotional well-being. But the choice of which fish to farm should be based on biological suitability and ecological fit, not just on chasing the latest market trend or trying to replicate a dwindling wild fish.
So it's a call to be much more intentional, much more strategic about both protecting the wild and developing the farm.
Exactly. It's a much bigger call to action than just reading labels.
It really is. To leave you, our listeners, with a final thought, I often think back to that image the author describes. Seeing his young daughter carefully release a bluefish back into Long Island Sound. In that simple act, she seemed to grasp both the power of wildness intimately, but also the right of that wildness to continue.
That's powerful.
It raises the question for all of us, doesn't it? Can we, as supposedly rational creatures, truly embrace eating new, perhaps less familiar, but more suitable farm species like Kahala? And maybe more importantly, can we find the collective will, the political courage to implement those large-scale reforms, the zoning, the global protection that are needed to genuinely conserve our incredible wild ocean heritage?
The future of that last wild food really does hang in the balance. It requires us to think bigger.
A lot to chew on there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.